start chatting, there's no going back. We're Hart-to-Hart podcast. We love to talk.
Welcome to our Hart-to-Hart podcast, where we will discuss hate crimes and what their impact is on the world. Hart-to-Hart.
Sure, we probably all heard the term hate crime before, but it's used so lightly, so do we actually know what it means? A hate crime is defined as an offence that the victim feels is motivated by prejudice based on a person's race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disability and gender identity.
These can actually show up in multiple forms, like verbal or physical abuse, just actions that are intended to make somebody feel uncomfortable, which can encourage violence against a community of people.
Between us, we will mention different types of hate crimes, groups of people that are oppressed, who will be subject to this, the root cause of this hatred, and most importantly, how to stop this behaviour.
Hart-to-Hart podcast. We love to talk.
Welcome to Let's Get Brainy. In this section, we will give you some insight on what goes on in the mind of somebody that is prejudiced and biased against minorities.
The reasons are usually intersectional, but there are different factors that can affect someone's thinking patterns, and we'll be exploring them.
In this podcast, we'll be talking about race and ethnicity. People of colour and people that originate from an ethnic background are often discriminated against because of their culture and skin colour. This is often a result of ignorance and bigotry, which may stem from a lack of exposure and little education about these topics. This lack of exposure is caused by systemic racism our society is built upon, biased media we see every day on our phones, and the environment we were raised in.
We will also be talking about religion, closely linked with racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semites and any other group that discriminates against religions are largely influenced by biased media, lack of exposure and education and ignorance.
We will also be discussing sexual orientation. People who have homophobic attitudes and are more prejudiced or discriminatory towards gay people are more likely to have a disagreement between their unconscious attractions to same-sex partners than what they are aware of, and are more likely to come from authoritarian homes. Even in today's society, young people are unaware of the consequences of saying casually homophobic things. For example, straight men who fetishize homosexual women but are prejudiced towards gay men.
It doesn't make sense. Why do people who aren't part of the LGBTQ+ community decide what's socially acceptable and what's not?
We'll also be talking about gender in this podcast, most commonly found against people who fall under the transgender term, transphobia, or women, most widely known as misogyny, which also falls under a lack of exposure. Though we have progressed so far in this day and age, there are still men who condescend women and have those stereotypes ingrained in their mind.
It's crazy to see how some people, including other women, get so affected by an independent, confident woman doing what she wants.
Like, what's so bad about a bright girl wanting to make a difference in this world?
We're Hart-to-Hart podcast. We love to talk.
Hello, my name is Connie.
I'm Daisy.
I'm Hannah.
And I'm Lily.
And welcome to the first hate crime that will be discussed today, racism and how it's developed throughout centuries in society.
I think an appropriate start would be to give you a definition of racism, which is defined as prejudice, discrimination or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior.
Quite bizarre when you think about it, to be honest. Why would you go out of your way to deliberately discriminate against someone just because they're of a different race?
It's important to note this is a pretty simplified definition for a very complex social situation, though.
Yeah, and there are loads of different types of racism, like systemic racism, which I think is more prevalent in the UK.
And that's where racism is taken into groups with more power, like governments, schools and businesses. It's probably the most harmful thing to people of colour, because they are then disproportionately affected by literally everything that governments and schools do, because none of it is in their favour.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and when people exercise that belief or implicit bias that they have against people of colour, it turns into racism. Did you know that racism was only made illegal in the UK in 1965?
It's not that long ago if you think about it.
Just goes to show that there's a lack of regard around this subject, and people who are in positions of power and privilege don't want to do anything about it.
Ah yes, white privilege.
To better understand privileges, there are statistics that show that white men take up about 43% of the workforce and hold 95% of senior management positions, and white women hold about 40% of the middle management positions. Black women, however, hold 5% and black men hold 4%.
Jesus, that's insanely disproportionate. But it's important to note that white privilege isn't the assumption that everything a white person has accomplished is unearned.
Rather, it's a built-in advantage in society that helps them to get to their accomplishments.
Another example of white privilege is that white people are less likely to be followed, interrogated or searched by law enforcement just because they look suspicious.
And they're less likely to be presumed guilty if they've committed a crime and less likely to be sentenced to death in countries where the death penalty is obviously still in enforcement.
This falls under institutional racism, but when racism is taken in exercise in daily life, the outcome is a hate crime.
There has been a significant rise in hate crimes towards Asian people, especially after the outbreak of coronavirus. UK police data shows a rise of 300% in hate crimes towards Chinese, East and Southeast Asians in the first quarter of 2020, compared to the same period in 2018 and 2019.
It's an awful lot in just a short period of time.
In 2013 and 2014, there was just under 50,000 racist incidents recorded by the police in England and Wales. On average, that is about 130 incidents per day.
130 incidents per day. Just imagine how many people are being subjected to this every single day. There's people afraid to even walk outside of their houses because of this.
You know, there was one person murdered in a racist incident, Stephen Lawrence, and he was just 18 when he was killed in a racially motivated attack in southeast London in 1993. His death brought light to the subject of racism in Britain.
It's like there's a pattern. A black person has to die or be violently discriminated against just for light to be shed on this issue almost every time.
Exactly, we saw this with George Floyd too. I don't understand why it has to be like this.
That leads us to our next part, which is what you can do to help combat racism.
We can all acknowledge it in all its forms and try to recognise it so that it's easier to call someone out for being racist. I think that's one of the most important parts, because when you recognise it, whether it's a microaggression or blatant racism, it becomes so much easier to educate the person.
Yeah, educating the person as to why their behaviour is harmful might lead to lots of people committing to anti-racism, so that people can no longer get away with pretending that racism isn't there.
And if you're in a position of privilege, it is insanely important to use your white privilege to uplift the voices of underrepresented groups. We can't all just become anti-racist overnight, you know? It's not some new update to the human system.
To conclude, make sure that you are reporting incidents of racism, because it's very much illegal and it's a very harmful form of discrimination that affects many people.
Say no to racism. We're Hart-to-Hart podcast. We love to talk.
Hello, and welcome to our discussion on the topic of sexism and misogyny.
Sexism and misogyny are often confused for each other, but they are in fact different. Sexism is defined as prejudice, stereotyping or discrimination, typically against women on the basis of sex.
This is often confused for misogyny, which is defined as a dislike, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women.
You may be surprised to know that this is in fact not a hate crime in the UK. This is said to be due to the worry that by adding it to the list of hate crimes, it would conflict with the principles of equality.
Sarah Everard is a woman who was raped and murdered by a police officer earlier this year. After her death, there was a surge in calls for more protection for women.
This was then followed by advice to ask the officers questions or flag down a bus if concerned. Very helpful.
I think this has further reinforced our opinions that feminism is still relevant and needed in 2021.
Feminism relates to the belief that women are equal power holders, and therefore it stands against any form of discrimination or subjugation that women face.
You'd like to think that everyone would consider themselves a feminist. However, there are many negative misconceptions about feminists. For example, they believe that they are above men, which we know is not true.
Feminists are also often mistaken with radical feminists, which is a branch of feminism that emphasises on the radical reordering of society in order to remove all prejudice.
There is still a lot that can be improved in order to achieve an equal society. This can be shown through things such as the gender pay gap, which shows that women on average earn 9% less than men.
Research also shows that 1 out of 3 women are sexually abused at some point in their lives. Shocking to think of the billions of women who have been subjected to such a horrific experience.
It would be wrong to have this discussion without mentioning the suffragette movement. This was a 19th, 20th century movement that focused on the women's rights to vote.
All women achieved the right to vote by 1928, 10 years after the vote was given to women who met a certain criteria. This was almost 100 years ago, yet we have never truly been equal.
I know that myself, along with many of others, have experienced sexual harassment, such as catcalling, even as a young teenager. This is widely shown as statistics show that 97% of women aged 18 to 24 in the UK have experienced sexual harassment.
I am sure that at this point you are wondering how this inequality can be prevented.
The majority of sexual assault and rape prevention is directed at women. Through this, we are teaching them that what happens to them is their own fault.
We must also acknowledge that this happens to men. However, it is estimated that 9,000 out of 78,000 reported rape or attempted rape victims are men. This means that the other 69,000 are women.
This is why we believe that there should be a change in the way we are educated about rape and sexual assault.
We believe that it should be less focused on how women can defend themselves or telling us not to walk home alone at night, and more about educating boys about consent and respecting women. I also want to mention that women who are part of the LGBTQ plus community are more likely to be subjugated to sexual assault and rape.
Charities and organisations such as Rape Crisis and the Survivors Trust give information, help and support to victims. However, we wouldn't need them if we started with education.
We believe that we can all do more by trying to call out people around us when they tell sexist jokes, or catcall or send someone's news to a group chat.
We hope you took something away from this, and remember to always listen and be supportive when others share their experience with you.
We're Hart-to-Hart podcast. We love to talk.
Welcome to our fourth section, where we will be discussing homophobia. We will be addressing the misconceptions, internalised homophobia, looking into various case studies as we discuss this very prevalent topic.
I feel it is important to give you a definition of what homophobia is. Homophobia is the assumption that everyone is, or should be, straight. It's fear, mistrust, hatred, or discomfort towards those who experience same-sex attraction. These feelings can result in extreme forms of prejudice.
Homophobic hate crimes have doubled in the last year, and transphobic hate crimes more than that. Now, to people like you and me, it is beyond us to understand why we can receive so much hate for simply loving who we want to love. But why do people feel this way?
Exactly. And why is there such a stigma around homosexuality on the whole? A stigma that is very damaging to members of the community and can stop people from expressing their true selves and even jeopardise long-term health.
Yeah, and as someone who's experienced the effect of these stigmas, I can confidently say that although the progressions are being made to combat the issue, homophobia is still a very big problem all across the world. The normalisation of it on the whole is at the cost and safety of happiness all across the community.
Now, we all live in the same community, and from phrases like, I wish I could just be gay, all the way to highly offensive language, I'm sure it's not a shock to you when you hear slurs or homophobic language used in a normal conversation.
Not at all. And the most common excuse is, I didn't mean it like that.
Exactly. So how did they mean it?
Well, here's the thing. They don't know. Most people who use these slurs have no actual idea of the meaning behind them, which could be said to be the worst part of it all. In fact, their knowledge of the history of the movement is entirely little to none.
In 1969, the Stonewall Inn was constantly raided due to homophobia within the police force. However, on June 28th, the people in the bar took a stand. This stand changed history and caused a tidal wave of political activism to grow in America, which aided in the gay rights movement.
And this is where we pull in Marsha P. Johnson. Marsh Peyton A. Mine Johnson was a gay and trans liberation and AIDS activist. She was a drag performer and had a key role in the Stonewall riots.
Marsha's legacy is still very much alive in the LGBTQ+ community, in the organisations which she left behind, giving shelter to gay and trans youth, and she is celebrated in numerous books, documentaries and films.
And whilst these revolutionary moments in history have brought the world so far, there is still a long way to go. In June of 2019, a lesbian couple were attacked by teenage boys after refusing to kiss in front of them.
Melania and Chris said they were surrounded by the men and they started becoming aggressive, saying things about lesbians and making them kiss so they could watch. The fetishization of lesbian and gay relationships is beyond unacceptable and has become something so normalised by society.
Same-sex couples have been constantly tormented and labelled hot and hypersexual, and we need to get one thing straight. Gay men are not accessories. Lesbian and bisexual women are not the objects of your sexual desires. They are real people with so much more to themselves than their sexuality.
This fetishization dehumanises people in the community and is so damaging. It's not hard to prevent either. The key, call others out when you see it happening. People will be better off because of it.
There you have it. It's as simple as that. I'm sure a lot of you are now wondering what you can do to help and be a good ally to the community.
A lot of people think that being an ally requires a lot of time and effort, but it's really quite simple.
Yeah, begin by educating yourself. Websites like My Workplace Health and Youth Engaged are great places to begin with this. Also work on confronting your own prejudice and unconscious bias. Be open, speak out when you see homophobic activity happening around you, and check your privilege.
Think of ally as an action as opposed to a label. And for those of you who wish to go one step further, there are many charities dedicated to supporting those in the LGBTQ+ community. Stonewall is one of the largest LGBTQ+ rights organisations in Europe, and the money raised is sent to many different things. For example, education courses for teachers, and it ranges from that up to opportunities to change the laws, making the world a better, safer and more inclusive place for everyone.
Stonewall's a great charity. One of my favourites is Gallup. Gallup works to be a helpline for LGBTQIA people who have or are experiencing violence. Your money provides support to people experiencing hate crime, domestic and sexual abuse, and even more work to making sure the needs of LGBTQ+ people are recognised.
With this, we end our segment and urge you to take strides in your everyday life to become a better ally.
Together, we can make a difference and create a better world for everyone, but we need your help.
This is not a fight we can win on our own, so act now and help to make a difference.
We're Hart-to-Hart podcast. We love to talk.
So now we go on to the final hate crime that will be discussed today, the discrimination of people on the basis of their religious beliefs.
Throughout the course of history, many millions of people have died simply for having differing religious views, a hugely significant example being the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were brutally murdered.
Even in contemporary Britain today, thousands of people face persecution for their religious beliefs. It's not just a thing of the past.
In the year ending March 2021, just under half of religious hate crime offences in the UK were targeted against Muslims, in which case saw just under 300 offences. The next commonly targeted group were Jewish people, who were targeted in 22% of religious hate crimes, just under 1,300 offences.
Regarding Islamophobic hate crimes, Muslim women are predominantly targeted and subjected to verbal and sometimes physical abuse. In particular, Muslim women who wear traditional Islamic garments such as the hijab or the niqab are penalised further.
The penalisation of hijabi women is not only Islamophobic, but it is also inherently misogynistic, as seen with France's hijab ban. The freedom to dress however one wants to is compromised, and yet again, the attack on women and their own human rights and freedoms grow. This ban attempts to not only contain Muslims in France, but to erase them from the public sphere, and subsequently will lead to an increase in Islamophobia.
Despite Britain being one of the most multicultural countries in Europe, religious discrimination continues to happen on a regular basis. To minimise the amount of religious persecution that occurs in Britain, we must educate ourselves.
Embracing cultural and religious diversity goes beyond recognising and tolerating cultural and religious differences. It calls for respect of diversity and a commitment to communicate and foster reciprocal relationships with people from all cultures and religious backgrounds.
Recently, in March of this year, a 33-year-old British woman, Sarah Everard, was raped and murdered by a policeman who goes by the name of Wayne Cousins. Later, on the 18th of September, Sabina Nessa, a primary school teacher, was murdered.
Despite it being an imperfect comparison in regard to vital differences in both cases, the lack of publicity surrounding the brutal murder of Sabrina Nessa, a Muslim British Bangladeshi woman, in comparison to the notoriety of Sarah Everard's case, is shocking.
Whilst the wider issue is epidemic of violence against women, we can't help but wonder whether race and other social categorisations, such as class or religious background, intersects with how much public coverage each case gets. And though it may be uncomfortable to make these comparisons, in the aftermath of the death of both Sarah and Sabrina, it is clear that social media shares were significantly higher for Everard-related posts than they were for Nessa.
The notion that interconnected natures of social categorisations such as race, class and gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, creates overlapping and independent systems of discrimination or disadvantage, is called intersectionality.
Intersectionality is complex and difficult to understand at times, but it sheds light onto the way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination combine and intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalised individuals or groups.
Through the lens of intersectionality, we can be able to begin to understand each other and how we together can dismantle the systematic oppression, in all forms, or begin to make way for liberation.
We're Hart-to-Hart podcast. We love to talk.
With this, I hope we've been able to prove that talking is a powerful tool we can all use to repair our society.
Staying quiet about these things will only impede the progress we have been making all these years.
So join us in our efforts to make the world a better, fairer and safer place for everyone around us.
This has been Hart-to-Hart. Thank you for your attention. Stay feminist.
Everyone's born differently, different ideas, different beliefs. Doesn't mean they should cause discrimination or segregation. Let's unite together as a population. Let's talk, let's debate, let's get over this hate. 'Cause we're just teens and we cannot wait. So turn your volume up to the